Welcome back to SideQuests, episode 43. Today we have an esteemed guest with us, Dr. Hawreliak, and of course my usual colleague, Mr. Wes Schantz. And so I'd like Mr. Wes Schantz to introduce him today because this is a special day. And so Wes, could you introduce our guest for us today?
Yeah, sure. So I came across your work actually through a site I think that you at one time curated. I don't know if you still do, the First Person Scholar. Is that still part of your duties?
No, I co-founded First Person Scholar with some fellow PhD students back in 2012, and I worked there as the essays editor until 2015, and but I'm not there anymore.
Okay, well, it seems to be still going strong. Actually, I was reading about Johan Huizinga's work, and that's how I actually came across your work, as it looked like your dissertation was about heroism in video games, and sort of the role of heroism as a death-defying narrative, how that helps to sort of establish meaning. So I was looking at that a little bit on academia, but at this point, it's something I guess you've moved into more semiotics. You've got a new book out about multimodal semiotics and rhetoric in video games, which looks interesting. I can't say that I've had a chance to check out that text yet, but maybe you could talk a little bit just first. Oh, and you work at, or rather you are at the Game Studies Institute at Brock University. Is that all correct?
It's the Center for Digital Humanities at Brock University, where I'm an assistant professor of game studies. But yeah, otherwise that was all correct.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm pulling from a number of different sources here, but we've got you on, so you can kind of tell us straight from the source. How has your research kind of developed since you initially got into game studies, now this more digital humanities kind of approach? How has your thinking about heroism and meaning shifted as you've been looking more at rhetoric and semiotics? Can you just kind of sketch in a little more detail there?
Sure. So my PhD is actually in English. It was at the University of Waterloo, and there's a strong rhetoric focus there. And what I was really interested in was, how are video games persuasive devices? How are they persuasive artifacts? How do they persuade us into thinking certain things, into certain courses of action? And in particular, I was interested in how military video games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, the Battlefield series, the Tom Clancy games like Ghost Recon and Rainbow Six, how do they serve as propaganda, essentially? How do they influence what we think about, say, the war on terror or the military generally? I think certainly in the North American context, and the US and to a lesser extent Canada, the soldier still has this very revered place in society. So, support the troops. During the war on terror's initial stages, it was blasphemous, frankly, to speak ill of the troops and to protest the war. And so I was interested in how propaganda functions, broadly speaking, and then my focus was on how video games kind of add to that conversation. And one of the things that I found when doing the dissertation is that video games, especially military video games, are very good at promoting a worldview that says US or Western military intervention is a good thing, that soldiers are heroes, that we should honor them, and moreover, that being a soldier is fun and that war is fun. So to me, this was an interesting confluence of factors that made video games potentially really good conveyors of ideology and propaganda and made them really persuasive. One of the things I looked at was how video games help us develop our own sense of the world, a worldview, an ideology. And that was important for my dissertation because I did a lot of work on Ernest Becker, who's a cultural anthropologist. And Becker's main idea is basically that human beings need a worldview to buffer us from the fear of mortality. That if we always thought about, we're going to die one day, that we would essentially be in a state of paralysis. So we need these worldviews. And so video games, of course, deal with death a lot. And I was just really interested in this intersection of death and heroism, and how worldviews can actually give us a form of what Jay Lifton's called symbolic immortality. And this is just the idea, and this is whether it's Final Fantasy, an RPG, or a first-person shooter, the idea that in performing heroic deeds in the world, you live on after death, like through song or movies or video games. And so I really saw video games, and still do, as this heroic medium. I mean, it's a cliche. They're power fantasies. They help us feel good about ourselves, feel powerful, when in our everyday lives we don't necessarily get that opportunity. So I was very interested in kind of that side of things, in the cultural anthropology side, the social psychology side. I did an experiment through terror management theory that tested if players actually think about their deaths when dying in video games. And I really liked that work, and I may return to it one day, but I had a question after my dissertation, which was, well, okay, I'm kind of taking for granted here that video games do persuade people, but what are the actual mechanisms at play? What are the semiotics of video games? And so in my dissertation, like I looked back at it not too long ago, and you start to see the beginnings of the ideas of multimodality, which is just basically how video games combine different means of communication at once. So modes are like speech and text and moving image and music. And my argument in the dissertation was that games use all these different ways to communicate information to basically reinforce the same message, which is that you are powerful, you are a hero. So that's where I got into multimodality and my work in kind of the mechanisms of meaning, I guess, in video games. And so that's what led me to write the book. And, I spent, I guess, 2 or 3 years on that. And that's where I'm at now.
Well, that's fascinating, because we've confronted a little bit sort of in opposition, sort of in terms of education, Ernest Becker's work and the denial of death, and also sort of the relationship between ideology and mythology, and how sort of there is an idea right now that ideology sort of parasitizes mythology, that it takes sort of the positive elements but leaves out the negative, which seems to be what Ernest Becker, as a neo-Freudian, focuses on himself, which is interesting, because something we've confronted in Final Fantasy VII is that the antagonist himself cannot confront his own death. But what the protagonist has to run into, Cloud, is the fact that he is not what he wishes to be. He's sort of an anti-Adlerian character. He has to recognize his own weakness. I'm not trying to push forward like a Christian mythology here, but he has to sort of humbly recognize his weakness and his lack of heroic attributes in order to truly become one. So one thing I'm interested in, and I'll put this kind of to the side, is what the intersection you think is between ideology and a robust mythology, and also propaganda as opposed to art. But then I also want just a more foundational question from you. How did you get into video games? What video games did you like when you were young? Because it seems as if you have a sort of a strong sense of narrative, since your PhD is in English, but you also have done some sophisticated thinking about this medium. And that's something else that we sort of talk about. How sophisticated really is the medium of video games? Does it stand up against narrative? And so I guess, we ask these big questions, and you can just pick and choose from what you'd like to answer there.
Sure. So I got into video games quite young. I had an NES when I was maybe 5 or 6, and just played Super Mario and Master Blaster and the Ninja Turtles game, which was, looking back on it, was really so unfair. Yeah, I know. I remember being really frustrated and just trying again and again. And later on, looking back on it as like a design, I can see, well, there's maybe some design issues here, but at the time, you just think that it's you. But I have really early memories of just, really determined to beat these games, and just getting a great feeling when you finally do. So I've been playing video games for a long time, and I really was a console player. I didn't play a whole lot of PC. I played mostly shooters, I'd say, for the majority of my kind of teens and early 20s. And it wasn't until Oblivion that I really saw the potential and the point. Like I got why people loved RPGs so much with Oblivion, that I got into them. And from then on, I've been just a huge Bethesda fan. And I think actually Oblivion and Skyrim are really good examples of the problem with video game narratives, at least in that genre. This question always keeps coming up. Like Ian Bogost wrote an article, I think last year, that basically argued, in the Atlantic, that basically argued that video games are better off without narrative because film and TV and books do them better. And my immediate response to that was actually a little bit defensive. I thought, no, that's not true. I think there are profound narrative moments in video games. On average, though, and in general, I'd say that they're probably not quite as strong in delivering a narrative, at least for me personally. But it is a very subjective thing. I think the reason for that is just that when you're making a game, like whether at the studio level, you're making it for a certain audience, and that audience often is more concerned with the mechanics, and the narrative supports the mechanics. All right. So I think that all too often the mechanics and the gameplay, as it's sometimes called, is what gets precedence. So it's not that I don't think video games can do really solid narratives, because they do. I just think for most of the medium's life, that hasn't been the priority, really. And there are, of course, exceptions. The Metal Gear Solid was really strong on narrative. Not that it was a good narrative necessarily, but it was just really important. There are, of course, text adventures. And so narrative's always been a really big part of video games. But, when you think of the games that got a lot of critical attention for narrative, like I think of BioShock, and then later BioShock Infinite. And, what those games were doing is not so profound when you look at similar themes in film and books. So my understanding of narrative in games is that it's an important aspect to making a game meaningful. Without narrative, you basically just have, I don't know, Pong or puzzles, right? And so I think that a narrative is really important, but it just hasn't been successful as often as it maybe could. And so that's why you're still getting pushback, people saying that narrative isn't important in games, or narrative isn't good in games. The problem, just to return to something I said a moment ago with Skyrim and Oblivion, those games are designed to make you feel as if you're in this big open world that you eventually master. And the challenge, of course, is, how can you do a really strong, cohesive narrative when there's so many moving parts and there's so much freedom? Same with GTA and Red Dead. When there's that ultimate tension and conflict between something that's, cohesive and coherent, and giving the player freedom. So something like Skyrim and Oblivion, I didn't think they had really a strong narrative. I couldn't really tell you what the story was about, except for in very broad strokes. But that's the challenge with games, I think, even in different genres, is how do we balance the player's freedom and sense that they can do what they want to do with delivering something that's coherent. And I have my students make little twine games, like very quickly, an interactive fiction tool. And very, very quickly, they see the challenge of, okay, well, how do we, make these choose your own adventure stories, these little games, and still convey the narrative that we want to. And so I think that's the fundamental tension. That's not saying anything groundbreaking. That's, been debated for a long time now. But I think it's something that will not go away. Like ludology, narratology debate, everybody's sick of, I think, and for good reasons. But I don't think that means we can't talk about narrative generally. We can't talk about the challenges of the medium of narrative, and some ways that actually the medium excels in certain forms of narrative. So I guess that's my general take on the question, and how do we reconcile, agency and coherence and cohesion? Well, I think it's very difficult, and there's probably only a handful of games that I've played anyways that I can say do it well.
It seems like to take that and look at sort of how people experience their own lives, that actually seems like a kind of the same problem maybe that we're seeing writ large in the culture right now, where, basic narratives that used to sort of sketch out a course of, what we call a good life are no longer really operative. Maybe that's a good thing, like people have more of a sense of freedom and kind of openness to various kinds of opportunities, but it also leaves a kind of absence, that sort of God-shaped hole that the existentialists might talk about, or something, less lugubrious. But anyway, there's a problem there too. And it's interesting to me that video games are kind of the ascendant medium right now, insofar as they sort of reflect that same, crisis of meaning. One interesting thing about your dissertation that I wanted to follow up with, for kind of looking at like war games and the narrative of the hero as a warrior particular, like how do you modify that? How do you make it more complex and sort of derive meaning in a peaceful world, or at least inject more sort of nuance into the old story of the hero as warrior? Do you have some examples or have some ideas about how that might be developed in games?
Sure. So that's Becker's central problem, or his central point, and the problem that he identifies is that, if I go out and slay my enemy and kill a bunch of enemy combatants, I've fought for my country, and so I get medals, I get maybe parades, and there's this very public way of showing off that I've done something good for my community. And that's all that heroism is at the end of the day. It's not a fixed thing. It's, what does my community value? That's what heroism is about. So what's optimistic about Becker's work and about heroism in general is that it doesn't have to be violence. It can be whatever the community values. Right now, I think there are a lot of video games that take an approach to valorizing characteristics and events that aren't typically heroic. So, Cart Life, a game like that, is making a commentary on capitalism and class. This War of Mine, I think, makes a commentary on war and how it's, I guess, in a way, just heroic to survive. I think about indie games like that, Dragon Cancer, Gone Home, which there's value in discovery and understanding oneself and one's relationships. So I think there's lots of ways that video games can contribute to a resistance, I guess, to this idea that you have to be violent and powerful in a traditional sense to be heroic. I think that's something I was interested in my dissertation was, well, how do we culturally establish a value system that is altruistic, that helps people, not at the expense of others? And that's the problem. That's something I still think about a lot, and I think I will return to in my research is, well, how do we actually change attitudes on a large scale? Because that's what we have to do, and it's very challenging. To jump around a little bit, the predominant worldview right now is certainly capitalist in nature. It's very easy to demonstrate that you're doing well through purchasing things and consuming things makes us feel good. So I can have a house or a car or clothes or the next iPhone or whatever, and these consumption practices make us feel good. Well, what if we were to counter that, the logic of hyperconsumption, with something like changing the systems that oppress people or changing the systems that allow for wide-scale climate change? What small part can video games play in changing people's attitudes? And I want to be really clear that video games are not going to, like, I'm not super optimistic. They're not going to change the world by themselves. They're just one part of this, of the broader discourse. But that's what I'm interested in, is what part can they play? And I think we need to get away from this idea that the hero is, the hyper masculine, shoot people in the face, gruff soldier, and that heroism can take many forms. It doesn't have to be fixed to military heroism.
Yeah, and it does seem as if we just take a broad view of media in general, especially movies in the West, that we have been moving away from that sort of hyper-masculine ideal since the 80s, like the Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone sort of 80s Rambo, Terminator superhero is to some extent being replaced, by, like, say, the sort of a Tobey Maguire-esque Spider-Man. And we're also finding, I think, greater diversity, especially, like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse that recently won an Academy Award last Sunday. I think we are seeing a transitioning heroic ideal. But I have two sort of interesting questions, I think, for you, which is, one is, do you think that the dearth of narrative in something like a shooter is okay for people because there is a prevailing narrative in their culture that the shooter plugs into so that it is just natural? And I think Wes was also sort of touching on this point that perhaps also why a game which is mechanically fascinating, like you said, BioShock or a Counter-Strike, a game that takes high technical skill and precision, that takes a lot of game hours to be good at, especially if you're competing against other actual people. Do you think that sort of has to do with how people do live their lives? Like, in general, we aren't necessarily concerned with whether we are on the empire side or the rebellion side. We're sort of focusing on the mechanics of everyday life and whether what we're doing feels sort of meaningful, or in the case of a video game is fun, or whether we're doing our job well, and that we don't really stop to sort of smell the roses or to reflect on what side we're really on. And just secondary to that, I'm really interested in whether you think that during times of sort of tension or like sort of war times, of course, it's sort of undefined whether we still have or what we're doing in the Middle East for America, whether during times of sort of conflict with other nations, games like shooters would become more prevalent and would even become more interesting to people in the West. And I know that we don't just play these games in America, obviously. And, sort of the joke on online message boards is that Koreans are the best at these games. Though I'd have to look at, there are giant world competitions now that I should look more into. But yes, those are my questions.
Sure. So on whether or not that times of war there's more tension, I think so. Matthew Payne wrote a really great book called Military Games After 9/11. I think I got that name right.
Great.
And he really looked at that question a lot, is how do games inform our understanding of the war on terror? That's what he was looking at. And how does the war on terror influence our understanding of games? And the thing I really liked about that book was he really demonstrated the two-way street there between games and, broader ideas about things like war. And something's interesting, though, if you remember, right, I think after the Modern Warfare series, which ended in 2011, there hasn't really been a lot of games set in the Middle East. Like, a lot of the shooters have gone back to like World War II or World War I, or to the, Call of Duty went to the future for a long time. And that's fascinating to me. And I don't know why that happened. Maybe just be that people got sick of the same old landscapes and the same old narratives, I guess. But to me, that's interesting. It's, right when the war on terror began to get to that stage, okay, this is really slogging on. This is a quagmire now. The narrative shifted and people became less interested in them. Whether there's a connection there or not, I don't know. I think that's fascinating. And whether shooters, a narrative in a shooter is, let's be honest, it's secondary. I think most people would agree to that. And the latest Call of Duty, Black Ops 4, just got rid of the narrative altogether, because that, from what I understand, that was a big part of their budget, we're developing these cinematic cutscenes, paying Kit Harington to do voiceover and motion capture work. And that was a big part of their budget. And a lot of people would either just, go through the campaign very quickly and never play it again, or not play it at all. People played Call of Duty for the online multiplayer and zombies. So nevertheless, I think that you don't need cinematic cutscenes to have a narrative. I think as soon as you have a setting and characters and visual rhetoric, you have a narrative to some extent. So I think that you something felt missing in the latest Black Ops. Like you kind of, even if you didn't pay that much attention to the narrative of a Call of Duty game, you still kind of, I was kind of sad that it wasn't there, because I didn't, that's a really good way to get used to the mechanics before you go to the online multiplayer. So that was that question. If you could remind me again of the other question you were asking, it's slipping my mind right now.
I was wondering whether part of the appeal of one of these games is sort of part of the appeal of everyday life, that we don't generally reflect on whether we are on the side of good or evil. We sort of reflect on whether we are doing our jobs well or performing our relationships well. So some of these sort of bigger narrative questions of these so profound questions of good and evil, or which side we're actually on, don't really come up. And whether that's part of the appeal of, say, a shooter where you're just you're like on the ultimate team, right? You are on a team where what is good is to win with your team and to keep them alive, or to get to the goal, where you don't really reflect on whether the goal is in general good or not. And in fact, I would add a corollary now, just thinking about it a little. Do you think that's sort of the path that heroes in narrative sort of tread? They're sort of doing what they do and they have a moment of realization.
Yeah, so it's very difficult in everyday life to know if you're doing good or not. There's no, plus 100 XP every time you hold the door open for somebody, or there aren't these quantifiable, very visible markers that you're doing good. So yeah, it's good and evil are not very readily defined. I think as you get older, you start to, develop the meaning for yourself, and you develop your own moral guidelines, but they're still not as clear cut as obviously a first person shooter. And I think one of the problems I had with the Modern Warfare series was that it tried to add some nuance to the story. I don't know if you played those games, but they basically, part of the narrative was like, oh, well, there's this conspiracy. In fact, one of the generals you're taking orders from is going to betray you, or does betray you. There's that No Russian scene where you're killing civilians in an airport with terrorists. And so they tried to complicate this very simplistic idea of the hero. But I think it ultimately failed because the mechanics of the game were shoot people in the face and that's it. There's no way to even get somebody to surrender. There's no way to talk it out, to try diplomacy, to try negotiating. And I think that's fundamental to how they convey their propaganda, is that these people cannot be reasoned with. These people just need to be destroyed and exterminated. And that's why we're over there, bombing these countries and occupying these territories, is because, that's the implicit message of the mechanics. So, Bogo's procedural rhetoric comes into play there. They're just through the mechanics of the game and the rules of the game. Those games are implicitly sending us a message that, well, this military intervention is not only the right thing to do, it's the only thing we can do to keep us safe and win this war. So I think that the idea of, a hero or a soldier just goes on, I just have to do my job, and then afterwards their realization. Yeah, I think that's a pretty common trope in games and other media. I find it a little bit shallow, I guess. And it almost seems like a superficial realization a lot of the time. Spec Ops: The Line. I actually think they did a really good job of, at their current moment, in complicating the idea of military heroism. So I don't know if you're familiar with that game and the white phosphorus scene. where it turns out that you're actually, killing a bunch of the people you're supposed to protect. And that's kind of flirting with, I think, with the idea of complicating military heroism. But before that scene and after that scene, it's back to just shooting people. And so it's, again, I think it's that conflict I spoke about at the beginning is how do we make a game that's, quote unquote fun for the audience, that's engaging, that follows generic norms, but at the same time, want to say something meaningful narratively. And I think that's very difficult for games to do. If you're just having people shoot enemies for 20 hours or 30 hours or whatever, and then at the end there's this cutscene that says, "Oh, what have I done?" To me, that falls flat. And I think that game developers, if they want to make that point, that they need to do mechanically and through the whole of the game. And it just feels kind of tacked on if it only appears kind of once or at the end.
How do you think this might sort of develop as people more fully embody their character in, say, like a VR kind of setting, as that sort of realism becomes more prevalent, maybe as their avatar is, if they're killed in combat, they actually die, have a permadeath kind of setting. How could that maybe change this? And as you're playing, not against the computer, but more against other people in other parts of the world, in online sort of settings. I feel like as you're talking, those were the kinds of ideas that came to mind for me. But I was also curious about how your teaching, what you do as an instructor now impacts the way that you think about games, and what kinds of things games can do as educational tools, more kind of specifically for kids, but maybe also for adults. I know that they're already used, obviously, as training, and indeed as sort of deployment systems for the military. So it's a very interesting kind of, I guess, realm of applications of games that sort of are unfolding before us. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I'll say off the top that I'm very skeptical of VR still as a gaming technology. I think there are a lot of really interesting applications for VR outside of games. Like one of the areas where apparently it's doing really well is in virtual tours for real estate, like realtors. So, I can just put on my Google Cardboard and walk around the house I want to buy. There's been this promise of VR for a long time, and what it's going to, this idea of total immersion, and embodiment. And I'm still jaded. I mentioned this in the book. I'm still jaded from the Virtual Boy. I don't know if you two are probably too young, but
it was awful. It was awful.
Yeah.
I remember it.
Yeah. And what was awful about it wasn't just the hellish landscape once you put it on. It was the promise and the hype that when you saw the commercial, and I was, I don't know, 6 or 7 or something, and this is the next evolution of gaming, and that of course fell very flat. And I feel like there's, maybe not to that extent, but there's similar promises being made every sort of like 5 years or so. Like when the Oculus Dev Kit 1 came out, maybe 2012 or something like that, maybe even earlier. There's again this kind of, okay, now we're entering the real era of VR, and it still hasn't really taken off. PlayStation VR does reasonably well. Last I checked, they had about 2 million unit sales, which isn't bad, but when you compare that to how many PS4s are out there, it's a pretty small percentage. I have an HTC Vive at the Center for Digital Humanities. We also have Oculus Rifts and PSVRs. So, and our students use them, and they play games with them, and they make games with them. So I think VR, when you put it on, you actually still feel very much like you're in a virtual space. I think what VR is lacking is the haptic feedback, the tactility, the sense that I'm actually in an environment. Really depends on this, proprioception, this feeling that I'm there, like all these physical forces that we get in the quote unquote real world. So its potential to, complicate heroism or what it can do about narrative, I'm still not sure, I guess. I think that where VR is really good is in things like horror games or like a flight game, things like that, where they do really well. In terms of narrative, I guess I'm still not sure. I'm not sure how it would be used any different than traditional games. Before we go on education, we can talk about that a little bit, because I do think it's interesting.
And I do want to go that direction, but just something I've been sort of mulling over since you brought up Ernest Becker and ideology, propaganda, and sort of how a hero can be a vessel of propaganda. I wonder if you also think there's a positive side to this. That is it possible that narrative and is it possible that narrative does not simply shield us against death anxiety? I understand that perspective, that sort of you're sitting around the fire. There are some terrible, you're a Neolithic person. There's some terrible, horrible, fanged beasts outside of the fire. And so you tell stories in order to forget about that. But so many stories focus on the fact that we are mortal. And it's funny, I'm just thinking about, I saw a horrific video yesterday of a snake hanging from a telephone pole, holding on to the head of a crow. Is possibly the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. This in Australia. And it made me think it's very good that we don't have as many snakes in America anymore. St. Patrick is, and St. George are hell of a guys, but do you think that, and sort of, Wes and I are sort of philosophy people, and a claim that Socrates, or rather Plato, makes is that philosophy is preparation for death. And so the sort of idea behind a philosopher, which I think would be the ultimate ideal behind an excellent mythology, is not so much that you can be immortal or immortalize yourself through valorous deeds. I think Achilles deals with this quite a bit in Book 9 of the Iliad, Achilles, but that you do die, and that perhaps there is a best way to live, or a meaningful way to live, in the wake of your mortality. Is there a function? Do you think that video games, if they're going to rise to this next level, do you think it's possible? Do you think that narrative can function in a way that sort of expands your consciousness, expands your mind to the possibility of your own death, rather than just shielding you from it? And B, do you think if video games can do that, that will be what takes them to the next level? Or do you just see them going in a different direction altogether?
Well, I think they certainly can make you aware of your own death, and they don't have to be these death-denying artifacts necessarily. But I think that's what Becker was trying to get at ultimately, was what we have to do to be better to each other, to stop meaningless conflicts, is to embrace our mortality and to understand that people have their own ways of dealing with their mortality. Because for Becker, that's the root of all evil, of all heinous acts, is that we cannot tolerate a worldview, a hero system, he calls, that's different from our own, because it calls into question the validity of our own. So if you have the one true belief system, well, then I must not. And so different worldviews are a threat to us. And I think that games or any other media that can somehow, I hate to use this term, but I'm just going to use it, breed empathy in people, and to think about how we can understand other positions. Well, for Becker, that's really the way to as cheesy as it sounds, to build a better world and to at least mitigate some of the worst aspects of human nature, of violence and oppression. So I think Karen Schreier has written about empathy games. That's a lot of fantastic. And I think there's a lot of potential for games to help us understand other worldviews. And I think some of them do. Like I think a lot of the BioWare games, the Mass Effect games and the Dragon Age games, I think they're not perfect, but they do a pretty good job at getting us to understand different viewpoints, different ways of seeing the world, and that there's actually benefit and value and not just accepting and tolerating different perspectives, but in valuing them. So I think video games certainly can. I think that's still rare. When you look at, like, if you just still look at the top 10 best-selling video games, it's a little bit depressing, to be honest. It's still, they're kind of the same old mechanics, maybe dressed up a little bit differently, like Fortnite or something. But really, there hasn't been that much change in the industry when you look at the most popular titles. But that doesn't mean that video games as a medium can't have us accept our mortality and have us resist these parts of us that think the only way to get ahead is to step on the heads of other people. So I think there's certainly potential there. The New York Times doesn't really do, not a game, but they do these virtual reality experiences, these virtual reality stories where they have you see the perspective of, for example, a refugee in the Ukraine. And I think that something like that goes a long way, where they're not being necessarily too prescriptive, although, technology and any sort of medium, there's always politics involved, but they're just kind of saying, well, here's what it's like. And I think that goes a long way to breeding empathy. What is that what they need to take to the next level? I guess it depends. For me, I think the medium is maturing, and as you mentioned a bit earlier, it's getting more diverse, which is much needed. And I think what's going to take them to the next level is really not so much the content or the narrative, but how do they actually deal with things like accepting other worldviews mechanically, right? Even BioWare, they're still very much done narratologically and through cutscenes. But as game designers, how do we build systems that are able to be viewed as bridging multiple worldviews? I think that's what's interesting. And there's lots of, I think, independent games that try to do this, but in the AAA scene, we're not seeing that very much.
Yeah, you mentioned Fortnite, and I have to say that I haven't played that one still, as popular as it is, but I feel like I have, because every time I walk around, I'm a substitute teacher, I walk around the classroom, I just see kids playing that on their phones. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like the main function for them is like this kind of distraction on the one hand, and also like social competition. It's like fierce. They need to prove themselves in this setting, and of course that's kind of the old story, right? And as an educator, it's very difficult to kind of get them to want to put that aside and learn about whatever else it might be, math or science or Spanish, that they're supposed to be learning about. I feel like those kinds of conflicts are just always going to be there, and always going to be something that has to be at the least, negotiated, if not sort of transformed. So that's just kind of my last little thought for you. Alex, I don't know if you had a final question you want to ask before we have to let our guests go.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that we don't have quite as much time today, so perhaps we could have you on another time. And I'm really interested in talking with you and your grad student, furthering this conversation about the relationship between ISIS propaganda and sort of recruiting through video games. But I suppose I want to end with just sort of a global question. Thank you for throwing it over to me, Wes. Just what do you think the future of video games is, and what direction would you like to see them go?
Well, it's really difficult to say. I mean, 3 years ago, I don't think anybody was predicting that battle royale games were going to be as popular as they are now. I think it's really difficult to predict where they're actually going to go. My hope is, I guess, not so much for this type of games that come out, because I think that there'll always be new genres coming up and new combinations of genres. I guess my hope for games is more on the industry side. I'd like to see the industry get more diverse, so we know that people from all walks of life play games. But if you look at most of the major studios, they're mostly, the employees, especially the programmers, are predominantly men and predominantly white. So that just necessarily is going to bleed into the types of games that are made and the types of stories that are told. So I think that greater diversity is really important for the industry. Tanya DePass's I Need Diverse Games initiative, I think, is wonderful. I think we're starting to see a lot more diversity in the critical sphere. Like sites like Waypoint, I don't think could have existed even 5 years ago. It's headed by Austin Walker, and they do wonderful criticism. So I'd like to see greater diversity, that diversity reflected in the actual studios themselves. And I think we've seen all this news lately about the layoffs and the CEOs making $15 million while you lay off employees, and record profits while you lay off employees. And I think I'd like to see the industry really tackle these labor challenges. One way is that's through unionization, but I think there's other means that you can go as well. But I think that's what I'm most interested in right now is how do we make the industry better for its workers? And I think that will in turn make for better, more interesting, more diverse games.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dr. Jason Hawreliak.
Hawreliak.
I'm never going to get it. Hawreliak.
That's okay.
Like Powerback. Hawreliak.
Thanks for your time, and best of luck with all your research and teaching. It's been really illuminating hearing your thoughts and giving us some more directions to go with this investigation.
Well, great. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
All right.
Thank you for being on.